Steve, thanks very much. Certainly appreciate the opportunity to be here this morning. I will tell you, ladies and gentlemen, that many of the folks in American government at the local and state level in particular owe Stephen Goldsmith a big thank you and a debt of gratitude. He was a forerunner, he was a leader, he was a trendsetter. When he was mayor of Indianapolis, he was the fellow who helped write the book on how to transform and how to change the way of doing business, and many of us were inspired by his work, and I consider it a distinct honor for me personally to be here today with him, and I appreciate his kind introduction, and I certainly appreciate the opportunity to be here. Again, the Ash Institute and the Kennedy School of Government recognizing the work of many hardworking Iowans several years ago, and the work of the Public Strategies Group that was our consultant group that worked on a number of different changes that took place in state government, which ultimately resulted in us receiving the award. So I'm really pleased to be here today. You know, I will tell you, I did something last night I should not have done in preparation for this. When I came to Harvard just a couple of weeks ago to participate in a political fellowship, the fellow who invited me, David Yepsen, who's a political columnist from Des Moines, as a gift for my coming out to visit with his class, gave me Winston Churchill's speeches, a book about Winston Churchill's speeches. So I decided that in preparation for this speech today that I'd read a few of them, and I realize how inadequate my speaking abilities are, and so I'm a little nervous about this morning. As I prepared for this, I'm out of politics, and so I have now time to read the newspaper thoroughly. I have decided for my own mental health that I'll skip the front section and the business section, and I'm now limited to the sports and comics. And in the comics section the other day, there was this wonderful, wonderful cartoon about innovation. Two characters talking to one another, and the fellow was suggesting he wanted to figure out how to solve the world's problems. And he started ticking them off: world hunger, climate change, healthcare crisis, the war, the various wars that are taking place. He said there's so many problems, and innovation has to be the key. And he turned to his fellow in the cartoon. He said, what do you think the key to innovation and to solving these problems are? And the fellow thought about it for a while, and he said, well, I'll tell you, I'm not sure innovation's it. He said, as far as I'm concerned, there are two things we ought to do. We ought to hug each other, and we ought to take a long vacation away from people. Obviously, that's not what you came here to learn. And so I want to put it in the context of real life. And in my sense, looking at my country's challenges, I suspect that many of these challenges are also the challenges of many of the countries represented in this room this morning. My country has a serious challenge in health care. We have 47 million people in the United States that do not have health care insurance coverage, do not have the peace of mind of having that coverage. At any point in time during the course of the year, 61 million of our 300 million citizens will be without health care coverage. We're told that 50% of those who do receive health care in America will have health care that was not appropriate for their particular condition. In other words, a mistake will be made. We pay $7,500 a person for our health care. It's the highest in the world. We rank 37th among developed nations in terms of quality. We have a serious problem with health care. And I will suggest to you that there is only one way to solve this problem, and that is to innovate our way out of the current health care system. America is concerned, as I'm sure everyone in this room is concerned, about the growing number of malnourished people in the world. Specifically children. 350 million children today malnourished. In developed countries, that's something that we ought to be concerned about. One answer is to innovate in agriculture. That's not an easy thing to do. We are involved in a war that is different than any other war that has ever been fought in previous history. The rules of war have changed. They have changed because now folks believe that civilians who are part of a government, who pay taxes to a government, are in essence enablers of that government. and therefore are fair game in the minds of those who wish to do them harm. The rules of war have changed, and how do we get ourselves away from that? And then there's this issue of climate change. You're all familiar with the fact that as the world gets warmer, sea levels rise, creates serious problems with storms, drought, floods, stronger strains of diseases, some serious migration issues as countries and coastal areas are eliminated. These are all major issues confronting my country and in some senses the entire international community. And I would suggest to you that the only way we're going to solve any one or all of these problems is through innovation. We have got to come up with different ways of thinking, different ways of approaching, different ways of doing things in order to solve these problems. But in order to innovate, I think you have to be very conscious of the barriers to innovation. If innovation were easy, we'd all be doing it. But the reality is it's not. It's very difficult. And I think that the difficulties lie in the four specific barriers that I've been able to identify in my own experiences in efforts to innovate that I want to share with you today. And the first, and I think the most significant barrier, is cultural. The reality is that most people are resistant to change. They become comfortable with the way of doing business. They become comfortable with what they know. Innovation is asking them to think differently, to act differently, to change, to tear down and put back together. And culturally, that is a difficult thing to do. Certainly culturally in my state, a Midwestern state, it was very difficult to do. When I approached the legislature on early childhood, for example, no one in the state legislature was giving much consideration to the significance of the first 6 years of life. To my way of thinking, based on the research I had done, the first 6 years of life are probably the most important period of time in an individual's development and training and education. More brain development, more opportunities in those first 6 years than in any other time. We spend a substantial amount of money on our primary school system. We spend a tremendous amount of money on great universities, but the reality is we spend very little of our time or resource on those first 6 years. And so I made the decision I was going to try to change that. When you are faced with the cultural barrier, and this is to reemphasize one of the points that Steve made, the key to it is leadership. The key is that leaders stand up and challenge that cultural barrier, challenge that notion that the status quo is okay. And to do that, the leader has to have a clear vision of a different direction, must use that vision to point out the contradictions, the difficulties, and the problems with the current status quo, and must use the leadership to create creative tension that results in change. What we did in Iowa in terms of early childhood is that we approached it in non-traditional ways. We didn't talk about cute little kids, which is easy to do. We brought in Nobel Prize-winning economists who had looked at this issue of spending resources and had determined that the most effective dollar that could be spent by state government in America was not on economic development, wasn't on the primary school system, wasn't in the universities. The greatest return for that dollar would be if you invested in an early childhood system and program. The return would be anywhere from $7 to $14 for every dollar you invested. We brought in the Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis to suggest that if you had $1 to spend on job creation or $1 to spend on the development of a youngster's early years, you would be far better off spending that dollar for that youngster. In other words, we made the economic argument. We made a non-traditional argument. We had a clear vision of a program that would support and assist these early learners. We set out that program, and then we made the economic argument that was non-traditional. We also made sure that legislators and people who were involved in policymaking understood how significant it was to the leader of the state. And the way I did that was in a very non-traditional way. The governor's office and I was a very big, beautiful building and a beautiful office, huge office. Got a big, huge desk. Everything about it speaks of power and authority. And you invite people down to your office, and usually they're a bit nervous about this. And so I began to develop a shrine to early childhood. I had a red wagon, and then I had a children's book. And then I had figurines made of children in Iowa who had true and real stories. And each week, as I invited legislators down, that shrine grew and grew and grew and grew. It was a not-so-subtle message that this was a priority and this was significant. We were able to get this done and overcome the cultural barrier that young children were not as significant or important as economic development or other key parts of the state budget. We got a program together that encouraged parents to be their child's first and best teacher, that created a child care system that was focused on quality, and we expanded access to preschool. We overcame the cultural barrier with leadership and by making non-traditional arguments. The second barrier that anyone who tries to innovate faces is an economic barrier. Because if you think about change, you are obviously going to have to direct resources to impact and affect change. And unless you are very lucky to have surpluses, most often you're having to deal with the decision of where do I find the money? How do I establish this innovation as something more important than what I'm already spending money on? That can be very difficult to do unless you have a budgeting system and structure at a local level, a state level, or a national level that is tied to results. And that's what we did in Iowa. We decided to overcome the economic barrier by being very clear about what the results were that we sought out of our government programs. We established at the beginning of my administration 4 or 5 main goals, and we required every department director, every agency, to link what they were doing to one or more of those goals. And that allowed us to make the case for change because we were able to articulate and use data to establish that this dollar was going to result in a specific result. In far too many cases, you talk about programs and policies, you never talk about results. And you never talk about a linkage of programs and policies to specific results. And that's one of the reasons why it's so difficult to overcome the economic barrier. Because you're actually asking a legislator or those who are in control of the power of the purse to redirect resources from one of their priorities to one of your priorities. And that is difficult to do. But if you have results and you have data, you can establish that their program is not working as well and that your program will work better. And then you can measure and assess it. The third barrier to innovation is an interesting one, and I think it's one that really needs a great deal of attention in this country, and I would suspect other countries as well. And that's the scientific barrier. The scientific barrier. We in this country have gotten away from government basically funding and assisting and encouraging basic research. We have privatized a good part of our research, which means that we are focusing our research efforts on trying to solve a specific problem for a specific special interest. If we're truly interested in innovation, we ought to be developing strength and a support of basic research that will allow us to learn more and more of the basics, which then can be used by the private sector and perhaps government to come up with new and innovative and creative ways. I think specifically in this regard in the area of climate change. The discussion of climate change today is centered primarily on the necessity of us being more efficient with what we use in terms of power and our transportation system, and developing renewable resources to provide power and fuel. And all that is well and good if all you want to do is essentially stem the growth of greenhouse gases going into the atmosphere. But that is not the challenge we face as humankind. It will not be enough to stem the growth, because we already have enough in the atmosphere to potentially cause serious problems. And so our challenge is actually to reduce the amount that's in the atmosphere to below levels as they were in 1990. Some European countries have had some success in doing that. Some Asian countries are working hard to do that. In the United States, we've actually grown by about 17–18% since 1990. So we've actually contributed to the problem. So we've got this tremendous challenge. And frankly, the only way we're going to resolve this challenge in this country and perhaps in other countries is through innovative ways by which we use traditional sources of power. Now, coal is a lot discussion about coal today, but if we could ever figure out how to sequester, how to capture it and sequester it and store it permanently, it is possible that we could significantly clean up the atmosphere. But the technology does not exist today to do that in one complete circle. We have some technology that captures it, some that sequesters it, some that stores it, but we don't have a system that does all of it. And I'm told it's 15 or 20 years away. It requires a scientific answer. And frankly, what's happened in science today in America is that we've moved away from scientists being individuals who provide basic information and data to those who advocate for a particular purpose. And I would suggest to you that if we're interested in innovation, we need to return to the day when the scientist is basically providing basic information and data and developing basic research. And governments have a responsibility to fund that. Not far from here, during World War II, a group of scientists met here in the Boston area. As a patriotic responsibility, they were challenged with the notion of how to come up with a way of detecting enemy airplanes or enemy submarines through the use of radar. These scientists did not try to advance their cause, or their individual cause. They were focused on the basic research that would allow them ultimately to discover how radar would actually work. That was then. Today, I think we see scientists who are regularly advocating particular issues and a particular focus and using data to make an argument. If we're truly interested in innovation, I think we have to return to a day when scientists were basically providing basic research. That's the third barrier. The fourth barrier is a political and regulatory barrier. The fact is we don't have processes in place that encourage innovation. Most government regulation and most government process really discourages regulation, or discourages innovation. When I came into office, we were faced with a serious budget problem in Iowa. And usually change occurs in the face of crisis or in the face of agreement. Oftentimes it's hard to get agreement, so sometimes you have to look for that silver lining in a crisis. And our silver lining was an opportunity to really innovate because we were faced with a budget process and a budget crisis. And we decided to take a look at our regulatory structure. There's been some interesting research about Americans in terms of regulatory structure recently. Recent surveys have suggested about a third of Americans operate out of self-interest, and well over half of Americans operate out of a sense of community, a desire to do the right thing for their neighbor. But our regulatory structures in America do not encourage that half of the population. They really attempt to regulate the third that's operating out of self-interest. And that, I believe, stifles innovation. So I'm suggesting that as you look at ways to innovate, you take a look at your regulatory structures to determine whether or not they constitute a barrier, and if they do, it's time to change them. And one way you can change them is by giving those in power trust, the freedom to make decisions, the freedom to make decisions without fear that they were going to be reprimanded if a decision in fact failed. There would be consequences, but you would not basically create a situation where individuals were fearful. That's what we did with charter agencies. We essentially made a bargain with our directors. We said we are faced with tough economic times and we have less money than we had the year before. And so we're going to have to give you less. But while we're giving you less, we want to give you more. We want to give you more authority over the decisions that you make. We don't want you to have to go through a series of bureaucratic hoops to make decisions about staffing and directions of policy. We want you to be innovative. We want you to be creative. We want you to come up with new ways to do things. And so we said to our Department of Human Services, is there a way in which we could better protect our children who are being abused and at the same time spend less money? And they came back and they said, yes, there is. But it will require a change. It will require us focusing our resources on the youngsters who are in most serious trouble and reaching out to community resources and encouraging the community to accept accountability and responsibility for children and taking those youngsters who were perhaps in less dangerous circumstances. So we redesigned the child welfare system. And the reality is we have substantial reductions of the number of youngsters going into foster care. We have more stable and secure homes. And we actually have resources freed up now to extend foster care to youngsters 18 to 21, so there's a transition period. The bottom line is by freeing up the bureaucracy, by challenging it to come up with a specific result and getting out of the way and letting them use their imaginations, they came up with a better system. When you set up a regulatory system, it needs to be transparent. In my view, it needs to be based on trust and not distrust. It needs to be empowering. It needs to be structured in such a way that people feel that they can make mistakes, that they won't be punished for mistakes. You know, the worst thing in government today is that people are fearful of making a mistake. And you cannot innovate. You cannot discover new ways of doing things if you are fearful of making a mistake. You will never get started. You have got to create a culture in which mistakes are okay, so long as you learn from mistakes, so long as you don't repeat the mistakes. Mistakes are okay. And finally, it needs to be dynamic. Our regulatory structures today provide for no opportunity for experimentation, to try something out for a period of time, to try it out in a segment, not necessarily the entire society. We pass a regulation and it's set in stone and it covers everybody and it's enforced and it's focused on punishment. It's based on a distrust. It doesn't empower anybody. And if it's not followed, people get criticized and punished. It's precisely the opposite of what it needs to be for innovation. If you had a transparent system, if you had a system with enough flexibility that you would try a regulation out in a different segment to determine from experimentation what works and what doesn't work before you expanded it to the entire society, I believe you'd end up with better government and better results. So as you look at innovation, I think you have to examine how you're going to overcome the cultural barrier and whether you have the leadership that creates the vision, the contradiction, and the creative tension to make it happen. I think you have to take a look at how much will it cost and specifically where will it come from and how do you make the case specifically to reorganize and reprioritize expenditures. I think you have to engage the scientific community in returning to one of its basic responsibilities, giving you the data and the information that will allow policymakers to make the right set of choices. And finally, I think you have to take a look at your regulatory and political framework and ask yourself whether or not it and it alone creates a barrier to change. Is it dynamic? Is it empowering? Does it emanate from a place of trust? Is it transparent? And if you find that it's not any of that, that's a good place to start. Let me close with a story, and then I'd be glad to take questions if time permits. As a governor, I had a lot of responsibilities, and the one responsibility I was not prepared for at all when I took the oath of office was as a commander-in-chief of National Guard troops. For those who aren't familiar with the American military structure, we have a standing army, but we also have volunteers at home who are part-time. They're called up during emergencies, and they train on a regular basis, and they are basically a state militia. They are controlled by the state. If there's a tornado or a flood or a domestic problem, they can be called up by the governor. The President has the capacity to nationalize the National Guard and send them someplace outside the United States to do duty. These are extraordinary people. They take themselves away from their families and their friends, go halfway around the world, put themselves in harm's way, and do it willingly because they act out of a sense of service and responsibility.